What would you do if the only thing standing between you and the children you love, the last piece of the sister you lost, was a piece of paper that said you were stable enough, settled enough, safe enough to raise them? What would you do if the man who could give you that piece of paper, the address, the status, the appearance of a life held together, walked into your orbit on the worst night of his own life and said something that sounded exactly like an answer? This is a story about two people who made a deal with the wrong person. Or maybe the right one. A Korean billionaire with an empire cracking under the weight of a woman's revenge. A black architect carrying grief like a second skeleton, invisible, heavy, always there. Two children who didn't ask for any of this, but became the reason everything changed. It's a story about what happens when you build a lie so carefully that one day you look up and realize it became the only true thing you have. Stay. Because by the time you reach the end, you will understand why Milo's 3 words destroyed a man who thought he was untouchable. And why Evangeline Moore said yes to a stranger at 11 o'clock at night and never, not once, regretted it. If you're new here, welcome. This channel is your home for stories that don't let go. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, and leave a comment below. What do you think Evangeline should have done? Take the deal, or walk away? Tell me. I read every single one. The Meridian Tower event space sat on the 42nd floor of one of Miami's most coveted addresses. A glass and steel column that caught the last light of the Atlantic and turned it into something that looked, from a distance, like gold. Inside, the evening was exactly what it was supposed to be. Beautiful, controlled, full of people who knew how to perform effortlessness. Evangeline Moore had been contracted to redesign the residential lobby of the building's lower floors, a project she'd won 9 months ago, before the world stopped making sense. She was there tonight because her firm's contact had invited her to the launch event, and because Simone had looked her in the eye over the phone that afternoon and said, with the particular bluntness that was her most annoying and most loving quality, "You have not left that apartment in 4 days, Evie. Go. Bring a card. Smile at someone." So she'd come. She'd worn the black dress that required no decisions. She'd put the business cards in her clutch and told herself it would be 2 hours, maximum. That was before she heard him. She wasn't trying to eavesdrop. She was standing near the far end of the terrace, away from the noise of the room, because the noise of the room had started to feel like pressure against her chest, and she needed a moment, just a moment, of Miami night air and the sound of the water far below. She had her back to most of the party. She was thinking about Eli, who had woken up crying again at 2 a.m. and hadn't been able to explain why. And she was thinking about Milo, who had asked that morning where his mother was, and she had given the same answer she always gave, and it still didn't feel like enough. It never felt like enough. And then she heard a voice, low and controlled, coming from the other side of the terrace partition. "I need a wife by tomorrow." It wasn't said dramatically. It wasn't said to her. It was the voice of a man who was used to stating logistics, the same tone he might use to say he needed a car at 6 or a document by noon. But something about the flatness of it, the naked desperation underneath the composure, made Evangeline go very still. She turned, just slightly. Through the gap in the frosted glass partition, she could see a man. Korean. A broad-shouldered stillness about him that didn't come from peace but from years of practiced control. Holding a phone loosely at his side and staring at the Miami skyline as though it owed him an answer. On the phone, she could hear the faint, tinny voice of someone speaking urgently in Korean. He wasn't listening anymore. He'd already heard whatever it was. Later, she would not be able to explain exactly what made her speak. She was a practical woman. She was also a grieving woman. And grief, she had learned in the 4 months since her sister died, had a way of burning through the part of your brain that managed caution. She stepped around the partition. "Who knows?" she said quietly. "Maybe I can help with that." He turned, looked at her for a moment with the particular expression of someone who has been interrupted mid-collapse and hasn't decided yet whether to be grateful or furious. Then he looked at her more carefully. Not the way men looked at women at parties, The way a person looked at something that had appeared exactly when they needed it and were trying to determine whether it was real. You were listening. I was standing on a terrace. You were speaking on a terrace. A pause. I'm not going to pretend I didn't hear it. Something shifted in his face. Not softening, recalibrating. Taeju Yu. He didn't extend his hand, just said the name, watching to see if she knew it. She did. Miami's architecture and design world was smaller than it looked, and Yu Capital Group had developed 3 of the most significant residential towers in Brickell and Coconut Grove in the last 5 years. She'd studied 2 of them. She'd wanted, quietly, to work on something like them one day. Evangeline Moore. She matched his register. I'm the architect who redesigned your lobby. A beat of silence. Then, almost imperceptibly, something that might have been the beginning of interest. Come inside, he said. Not here. They sat in a private room that the event staff unlocked for him without being asked, which told her everything she needed to know about the kind of man Taeju Yu was in rooms like this one. He ordered water. She ordered the same, because she wanted to be clear-headed for whatever this was. He laid out the situation the way an architect laid out a structural problem, not performing vulnerability, just transmitting the load-bearing facts. His former fiancée, Ji-eun Baek, had released a carefully constructed story to 3 major outlets that afternoon. Private messages, a narrative about his character assembled from real moments and false conclusions, timed to land the night before a critical meeting with a sovereign wealth fund from Southeast Asia. The fund's representatives valued reputation above almost everything. The story painted him as a man without warmth, without integrity, without the capacity for genuine partnership. It's not entirely untrue. There was something in the way he put it. Not self-pity, not excuse, just the flat honesty of a man who had decided lying would waste both their time. Some of what she released is based in reality. She chose the parts that would do the most damage and framed them in the worst possible light. That's the particular genius of it. I can't deny everything, which means I look guilty of all of it. Evangeline was quiet for a moment. She understood, in the way architects understood structure. Not the aesthetics of a thing, but the load-bearing logic beneath it. What he was asking for. Not a girlfriend. Not a companion. A counter-narrative. Something visible and credible that said, this man has stability, warmth, a real life. This man is not the thing she described. But what does a wife by tomorrow actually mean? She asked. I need someone beside me at the fund dinner on Friday. I need someone whose presence at my address, at public events, in photographs, changes the story enough to keep the meeting from collapsing. I need 60 days, 90 at the most, after which we part professionally, and I compensate you for your time generously. She should have said no. She knew that. In the part of her brain that had not been hollowed out by 4 months of grief, and 2 months of courtroom documents and Constance Adler's lawyer using the words financial instability in a voice like a verdict, she knew. But there was a hearing in 3 weeks, and the judge wanted to see stability, and Constance Adler had a law firm and a Coral Gables address, and a way of making Evangeline feel like a woman holding a house of cards in a windstorm every time she walked into that courtroom. And 2 little boys were asleep right now at Simone's apartment, because Evangeline's 1-bedroom in Brickell had started feeling, lately, like it was shrinking. I have a situation of my own, she told him, and she laid it out in return. Not everything. Not the part where she still woke up some mornings and reached for her phone to call her sister and then remembered. Not the part where Eli had asked her once, very quietly, if she was going to disappear too. She gave him the facts, the custody battle, the court date, the grandmother with resources and a lawyer, and a narrative about what a proper home looked like. She gave him what the judge had asked to see, the full picture, in plain terms. He listened without interrupting. Another thing she noticed about him. He was one of those people who listened with their whole attention. It was slightly unnerving. It made her feel, in a way she hadn't felt in months, like what she was saying mattered. The boys would need to be at the residence. Her voice left no room for negotiation. That's not negotiable. They go where I go. A pause. Something crossed his face that she couldn't read. Fine, he said. They moved through the terms methodically. Separate bedrooms. He confirmed it immediately, without hesitation. And the way he did it settled the question so completely that it never needed to be raised again. Duration, 90 days, with a review at 60. Compensation, a monthly retainer plus his attorney joining her custody legal team. She pressed on what happened if it failed, if the fund withdrew, if the court wasn't moved. He looked at her steadily. Then we both lose and we part as two adults who tried something that didn't succeed. I'll still compensate you. She nodded slowly. I need to think about it tonight. Of course. She stood to leave. At the door, she paused. Why didn't you just call someone? An agency, a contact? He was quiet for a moment. I did. This afternoon. None of them felt right. Another pause, shorter. You feel right. She didn't let herself examine what that meant. She walked out through the glittering party, took the elevator down 42 floors, sat in her car in the parking garage for 11 minutes, and called Simone. A stranger just offered me a deal. Fake wife, 90 days, his address, his lawyer. A beat. And I'm seriously considering it. Simone was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Is he fine? Simone? Is the money real? He transferred a retainer to my account before I left the building. Another pause. Then, in the voice Simone used when she had already made a decision but was going to let Evangeline arrive at it herself. Evie, you have a hearing in 3 weeks and a grandmother with a Coral Gables lawyer who called your apartment a transitional space in open court. Do you remember that? Transitional space. Evangeline stared at the concrete ceiling of the parking garage. I'm calling him, she said. Teju Yu's house in Coconut Grove was the kind of place that made you understand, viscerally, what the word compound meant. Not in the sense of a fortress, but in the sense of something self-contained, its own world. Modern architecture, clean lines, the kind of discipline in design that spoke not of coldness, but of intense precision. Glass and pale stone and a garden that ran all the way to a private dock on the water. Beautiful. And, as Evangeline walked through it for the first time on a Thursday morning with a weekend bag over one shoulder and Milo's hand in her right hand, and Eli walking slightly ahead with his jaw set in a way that broke her heart a little, completely silent. The housekeeper, Mrs. Park, a Korean woman in her late 50s who had been with Tae-ju for 6 years and conveyed, in every expression, a deep and patient skepticism about most things, showed them to the east wing. 2 rooms, connected by a sitting room, one for the boys, one for Evangeline, clean, tasteful, clearly prepared in a hurry. Tae-ju was in a meeting when they arrived. This, she would later understand, was not avoidance. It was simply how he operated. His world ran on a schedule that didn't pause for arrivals, emotions, or the sound of a 3-year-old's sneakers squeaking on travertine floors. Milo went directly to the window. Outside, beyond the garden, the water was bright, and the sky was the particular blue that Miami saved for mornings. Big. The word came out of him with the total solemnity of a 3-year-old delivering an important verdict on the world. Beside him, Eli was silent. He stood in the middle of the room with his small arms at his sides, taking it all in with the expression Evangeline had come to recognize. The look of a child who had learned to assess environments for safety before he allowed himself to feel anything about them. It was the look that wrecked her most, because it wasn't something a 7-year-old should have to know how to do. She crouched down to his level. What do you think? He looked at her for a moment. Is this real? Yes, baby. Are we staying? For a while. He processed this the way he processed most things, quietly, internally, with no indication of what he'd decided until the moment he was ready. Then he walked to the window next to Milo and looked out at the water. Okay. he said. Taeju came out of his meeting at noon. He found Evangeline at the kitchen counter with a cup of coffee and a stack of design files, Milo asleep on the couch in the adjacent living room under a blanket she'd found in the linen closet, and Eli sitting at the other end of the counter doing something in a notebook. The scene had the accidental domesticity of a life already lived in, and for a moment, Taeju stopped in the doorway as though he needed a second to adjust. Ooh, he's drawing the water. Evangeline didn't look up from her files. He's been at it since he woke up from his nap. Don't disturb him when he's drawing. Taeju looked at Eli. Eli, without looking up from his notebook, was already watching Taeju with that measuring gaze. What's your name? Eli asked. Taeju. Eli considered this. That's a hard name. Yes. Can I call you TJ? A pause. Evangeline held very still, pretending to read her file. If you'd like, Taeju said. Eli nodded once, as though something had been settled, and went back to his notebook. Taeju poured himself a coffee and sat at the other end of the counter, 3 seats away from Eli, and opened his laptop. Neither of them spoke for 20 minutes. It was, Evangeline would think later, the most honest conversation she witnessed in the first week. The public appearances began that Friday. The fun dinner was at a waterfront restaurant in Key Biscayne. 12 people, a private room. The kind of meal where the food was secondary to the architecture of trust being constructed around the table. Evangeline wore a deep green dress. She sat to Taeju's left. She spoke when spoken to, listened when she should, and said 3 things across the course of the evening that made the lead representative from the fund laugh genuinely. Which was, she noted, something the rest of the table had failed to produce all night. In the car afterward, Taeju was quiet for a long time. The comment about the building in Kuala Lumpur. A pause. How did you know he'd worked on it? He mentioned a project in his bio on the fund's website. I looked everyone up before we came. She looked out the window at the causeway, the city lights on the water. I'm an architect. I research things before I walk into them. Another silence. Then, with the economy of a man who weighed his words before spending them, that was well done. She acknowledged it with a small nod and didn't make more of it. But she noticed, in the dark of the car, that something in the set of his shoulders had changed. Less contained. Not relaxed. Taeju Yu did not relax. She was beginning to understand. He simply existed at different altitudes of tension. But something. Over the next 2 weeks, they built a rhythm, not intimacy, a structure. He left early. She took the boys to school, ran her firm from the study he'd given her, picked them up. He was home for dinner 3 nights out of 7, and when he was 1, he sat at the end of the table and said very little. But he was there. That was what Eli was watching for, she realized. Not warmth, not conversation, just consistency. The simple, unfancy reliability of showing up. Taeju Yu, whatever his other qualities, showed up. One evening she found him in the garden at 9 o'clock at night, standing at the edge of the dock looking at the water. She'd come out to deliver a message from Mrs. Park about the morning schedule. She gave it, and then didn't go back inside immediately. You do this every night? She asked. Most nights. What are you thinking about? He was quiet for a moment. Not evasion, consideration. She was learning to tell the difference. Whether I've spent the day on things that will matter in 10 years. She stood beside him and looked at the water. And, have you? Some of them. A pause. You. She thought about Eli's notebook, which now had 11 drawings in it. She thought about Milo falling asleep at the dinner table and Taeju, without comment, standing up and carrying him to his room, an act so quietly competent that she'd had to look away. She thought about the custody file on her desk and the hearing that was now 8 days away. I think so, she said. I'm trying. He nodded. That was all. But they stood there for another few minutes, and neither of them moved to go inside, and Miami put on its best version of the night around them. Nothing. That was what she called it. Proximity. Circumstance. Two people sharing a complicated situation who had found a way not to make it worse. Nothing more. But a part of her, the part that understood load-bearing structures, the part that knew when something was carrying more weight than the blueprint intended, knew that wasn't quite true. There was an evening, the third week, that Evangeline didn't expect to keep thinking about but did. She had come home from a client walkthrough later than planned and found the house in a state she had not anticipated. Dinner made, not elaborate, not performance. Mrs. Park had left at 5 door, and Tae-ju had, apparently, cooked. The table was set. Milo was in his high chair with sweet potato on his chin. Eli was doing something purposeful with a spoon that suggested he had been involved in the making of something and was proud of it. Tae-ju stood at the stove with his back to her, in the same suit jacket he'd worn all day, but with the sleeves pushed up, which was the closest thing to casual she had ever seen him. She stopped in the doorway and took it in. The whole scene. The quality of the light. The sound of Milo narrating something to himself in the private language of toddlers. Eli glancing up with the expression of a child who had done something good and wanted her to notice. She noticed. "You didn't have to," she said. He turned from the stove. "You had a long day." Turned back. "Sit down." She sat. He put food in front of her. Korean beef and rice. Simple. Nothing elaborate, but made with the attention of someone who had decided it mattered. She ate. Eli told her, in great detail and with considerable digression, about a boy at school who had a dog with only 3 legs, and why that was objectively the best kind of dog to have. Milo fell asleep upright in his chair partway through dinner, as he had been doing with increasing regularity, and which never stopped being the funniest and most tender thing in the world. When Tae-ju lifted Milo out of the chair, the boy draped over his shoulder like a small, trusting dead weight without waking. Eli watched and then looked at Evangeline with a 7-year-old's version of a raised eyebrow. "He's getting good at that," Eli observed. "Yeah." She didn't look at Tae-ju. She didn't need to. "He is." Something was happening in this house that the contract hadn't accounted for. She knew it the way she knew structural things. Not because she'd measured it, but because she could feel the load shifting. She had not been invited. Or rather, she had. It was the kind of event that Miami's social infrastructure issued broadly to anyone with enough profile. But no one had expected her to come. Or perhaps everyone had, because the room shifted when she entered in a way that suggested people had been waiting for it. Ji-eun Baek was the type of woman whose elegance read as armor, immaculate, precise. She moved through the room with the unhurried confidence of someone who had prepared for exactly this. She found them within 15 minutes. Tae-ju. The warmth in her voice was a performance so polished it was almost indistinguishable from the real thing. Almost. And this must be Evangeline. I've heard so much. She pressed a small bouquet of flowers, white orchids, perfectly wrapped, into Evangeline's hands. The way a person handed a gift who knew the gesture would be read as aggression, and was counting on it being too subtle for anyone else in the room to see. Evangeline took the flowers with a smile that gave away nothing. "They're beautiful. Thank you." Ji-eun's eyes moved between them. Cataloging, assessing what was real and what was performance, and how much of the distance between them she could use. "You look well," she said to Tae-ju. "Ji-eun." One word. It said, "I see you." It said, "I know what you're doing." It said, "I am not going to perform discomfort for your benefit." And it worked, in that it gave her nothing. But Evangeline watched Ji-eun absorb it, and she saw something flicker behind the composure that wasn't hurt. Exactly. It was sharper than hurt. It was the look of a person who had been anticipating a particular reaction and received a different one and was recalibrating quickly. Ji-eun stayed for 3 minutes, said 3 perfect things, and moved away into the crowd. Evangeline watched her go. "She's not finished," Evangeline said quietly. No. Tae-ju looked straight ahead, not at Ji-eun's retreating figure. She never is. They didn't discuss it further that night, but something had crystallized for Evangeline. This wasn't just a business problem he was managing. Ji-eun Baek had done what she'd done not purely for strategic reasons. There was something personal in it, something that had to do with loss and pride, and a story Ji-eun was still writing in her head where she was the main character. That made her more dangerous than a strategist. It made her unpredictable. 2 days later, Evangeline's phone rang. Ji-eun had found her number through a mutual contact. The world of Miami design and real estate was, again, smaller than it appeared. She proposed coffee, her tone warm, reasonable, entirely believable. Evangeline accepted, because she understood that the only way to know what Ji-eun was building was to stand close enough to see it. They met at a cafe in Brickell on a Tuesday morning. Ji-eun arrived first, already seated, coffee untouched, which meant she'd been there long enough to compose herself. "I want to be honest with you," Ji-eun began, which is the thing people say when they are about to be selectively honest in a way they've calculated very carefully. The information arrived graciously, with apparent reluctance, like a woman performing a painful duty. That Tae-ju had known about the custody hearing before approaching her. That he'd had his legal team research her situation. That the meeting at the Meridian Tower had not been accidental. That she hadn't been chosen because the moment happened to align. She had been chosen because she was useful. "I'm not saying this to hurt you," Ji-eun finished. "And I'm saying it because I think you deserve to know what kind of man you're living with." Evangeline looked at her coffee. She thought about the way Tae-ju had said you feel right in a private room on a Tuesday night, and the way she had believed it because she'd needed to. She thought about Mrs. Park's quiet competence and Eli's drawings and Milo asleep on the couch, and the sound of Tae-ju's voice saying, "Fine," when she'd laid down the condition about the boys. One word, no hesitation. She thought, this woman has chosen every word of this conversation with the precision of someone who has rehearsed it. And she thought, that doesn't mean it's false. Thank you for telling me. Her voice was steady. I'll think about what you've said. Ji-eun nodded with the expression of a woman who had accomplished what she came to accomplish. She left. Evangeline sat at the table for another 20 minutes, finishing her coffee, letting the information settle into her chest, where it joined everything else that already lived there. That night, she didn't confront him. She went home. She had started thinking of it as home, and now recognized that as its own kind of information, and made dinner for the boys, and helped Eli with a school project, and put Milo to bed, and sat on the edge of his small bed for a while after he fell asleep, listening to him breathe. And she thought, I need to know. Not from Ji-eun's version. From him. She waited until the boys were asleep. Not because she was afraid of the conversation. Because she had learned, in 4 months of custody hearings, that precision mattered. And she needed to be sure of what she knew before she named it. She found him in the study. The question was direct. Had he known about her situation before that night at the Meridian Tower? He didn't answer immediately. He set down the glass he was holding. He looked at her with the complete stillness that she now recognized as his form of honesty. The way he went very quiet when something deserved to be taken seriously. And then he told her. He had not researched her deliberately. He had not engineered the evening. But after she'd spoken to him in the parking garage and called to accept the offer, his legal team had, as a matter of routine due diligence, run a background check. They found the custody case. And his lead attorney had filed, without telling him first, made a call to a legal contact with information about Constance Adler's case, a conflict of interest issue in how her team had filed certain documents that had quietly strengthened Evangeline's position. The attorney had flagged it to Tae-ju afterward, treating it as a minor administrative item. Tae-ju had not corrected the action. He had told himself it was in Evangeline's interest, and therefore acceptable. You made decisions about my case. The quiet in her voice was not calm. It was the kind of quiet that came from holding something very tightly. On my children. The children I'm fighting for. Without telling me. Yes. Because you decided it was for my benefit. Yes. And it didn't occur to you, she continued, very quietly, that the entire reason I'm in this fight is because someone has been deciding what's best for those children without asking the people who actually love them. The silence that followed was not the silence of a man who had no answer. It was the silence of a man who had received an answer he hadn't considered, and who was honest enough to sit with it. She packed a bag. Not because she was ending the arrangement. The hearing was in 6 days, and she was not willing to sacrifice Eli and Milo to her own anger, but because she needed to be somewhere that was hers, that didn't ask anything of her. She took the boys to Simone's. Simone, because she was Simone, made tea and said nothing, and let her sit on the couch and eventually asked, "Are you leaving, or are you regrouping?" "Regrouping," Evangeline said. "I think." "Good, because he did something wrong and he knew it by the time you finished the sentence. I saw his face." A pause. "He cares about those boys, Evie. That's real. People don't carry a 3-year-old to bed out of strategy." Ji-eun met with Constance Adler. Simone went very still. "How do you know?" "My lawyer called this afternoon. Constance's team filed a supplemental brief 2 hours ago citing recent press coverage, which means they're planning to use the renewed scandal in the hearing." Ji-eun gave them the ammunition. "They're going to argue that my living situation is unstable because the man I'm living with is under public scrutiny." So she got what she wanted. She got what she wanted. Evangeline closed her eyes. "The hearing is in 6 days, and I am sitting on your couch because I walked out of the most stable-looking address in Miami." Silence. "What do you need?" Simone asked. Evangeline thought about Eli's face when she'd told him they were going to Simone's for a few days. The careful, watchful return of that assessing expression. The one that said, "I'm checking whether adults are about to disappear again." She thought about Milo, who had packed his backpack with 3 toy cars and a drawing of the water and put it on his back with total confidence that wherever they were going, the important things were going with him. "I need to go back," she said, "but on my terms." What she didn't say to Simone that night, because she hadn't quite admitted it to herself yet, was this. The thing that had hurt most wasn't the action itself. She could acknowledge, in the cold-eyed way she assessed most things, that his attorney's intervention had probably helped her case. The thing that had hurt was that for a moment, when Ji-eun laid it out in that careful, "I just want you to know" voice, Evangeline had felt what she always feared feeling, that she was someone things happened to, rather than someone who happened to things. She had been fighting that feeling since the morning she got the call about her sister, the feeling of the world moving without her consent, of arriving at a scene already decided. Eli and Milo needed her to be someone who held the wheel, and she had been. She had held it with both hands every day since, and she was tired, profoundly tired, but she had held it. And then Taeju's attorney had reached into her case and moved a piece, and she'd felt the wheel slip, just slightly, and it had terrified her in a way that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with the last 4 months. She knew that. Sitting on Simone's couch at midnight, she knew it clearly. Understanding where a feeling came from didn't mean you got to ignore it. It meant you could take it seriously without being consumed by it. She was angry at Taeju. The anger was fair, and she was going back. Both things were true. She had stopped, somewhere in the last several weeks, needing them to be only one thing. She didn't call. She drove back. It was past 10 at night. The house was quiet. Mrs. Park had gone to her quarters. The garden lights were on, and the dock was lit softly at the water's edge, and Taeju was there. The place she'd come to understand was where he went, when something was working on him. He heard her come through the garden, but didn't turn around immediately. When he did, his face had none of its usual management in it. It was, for a moment, simply a face. "The boys?" he asked. "With Simone, I came alone." He nodded, waited. She came to stand beside him, not close, but at the dock's edge, looking at the water the way they had a few weeks ago, when none of this had happened yet. A different night, and a different version of whatever they were. I need to say something, and I need you to not say anything until I'm finished. All right. What you did was wrong. Not because the outcome was bad. Your attorney's information may have actually helped my case, and I'm aware of that, and it's complicated. It was wrong, because it removed my agency in something that is mine. I have spent 4 months fighting to prove that I am the right person to raise Eli and Milo, that I am capable, that I am stable, that I make good decisions for them. And you made a decision that touched that case without telling me. You turned me into someone who was being managed rather than someone who was making choices. And that... Her voice didn't break, but it thinned slightly, just enough to tell the truth. That is what Constance Adler's entire argument is built on. That I can't manage my own life. She stopped. The water moved. Miami breathed around them. I understand. 3 words. No defense, no elaboration, nothing added to dilute them. She looked at him. I came back because I need to be at that house for the hearing. And because Eli relaxed in your house in a way he hasn't relaxed since his mother died. And I won't take that from him because you and I are in a complicated situation. That's not the only reason you came back. It wasn't a challenge. It landed quietly, with the same precision he gave to most things, not confrontationally, but directly, the way he named everything that mattered. She didn't answer it, not directly. I'll bring the boys back in the morning. We'll get through the hearing, and then we'll talk about what happens after. He nodded. Evangeline. She was already turning to go. She stopped. I'm sorry. A pause, then more carefully. Not for the outcome, for taking the decision from you. Those are different things, and I understand that now. She stood there for a moment with her back to him, and the Miami night all around her, and the water making its small, patient sounds. Then she walked back through the garden without answering, because some things needed a day or two to become words. She had not slept the night before the hearing, not because she was afraid, though she was, but because her mind kept running the structure of it, the way she ran the structure of a building before a client presentation, where the weak points were, where it could hold, and where it might give. She knew the case. She had lived the case for months, but knowing it and trusting it were different things. And at 3 a.m. in a house in Coconut Grove with 2 boys asleep down the hall and a man in the room on the other side of a wall she had promised herself she would not cross, she trusted almost nothing. She got up at 4 and went to the kitchen and made coffee and sat at the counter in the dark. After a few minutes, she heard footsteps. Not the boys, too measured, too deliberate. Taeju appeared in the doorway. He looked at her. She looked at him. He went to the cabinet and got a mug and poured coffee and sat at the counter on the other side, 3 seats away, appropriate distance, nothing demanded, exactly as he had on the very first morning, as though some things between them had come full circle. They sat in the kitchen in the dark and drank coffee and didn't say anything for a long time. Which was, she thought, its own kind of thing. The ability to be silent with someone in the 4 o'clock dark without it needing to be filled. She had not had that with anyone since her sister. At some point, quietly, you've done everything right. She looked at her coffee. You can't know that. I've watched you for 6 weeks. I know it. She didn't answer. But something in her chest that had been holding tight since approximately 4 months ago released, fractionally, like a knot at the first loosening, still knotted, but beginning to believe it was capable of coming undone. They sat until 5:30, when Milo appeared at the kitchen door in his pajamas demanding cereal, and the 4 o'clock dark became a morning. Constance Adler arrived with 2 attorneys and a supplemental filing that cited public press coverage, the ongoing reputational controversy surrounding Taeju Yu, and what her team called the precarious nature of the current living arrangement. They had a photograph, taken outside the house 2 weeks earlier, taken by someone, of Evangeline and the boys. They argued that a woman choosing to link herself to a man under public scrutiny demonstrated questionable judgment. They used the words, transitional and unstable twice each. Evangeline's attorney was prepared. The response brief addressed each point. The financial documentation was clean. The address was impeccable. The school enrollment records, the medical appointments, the daily structure she'd built for Eli and Milo. All of it was documented, thorough, and real. Constance Adler, when it was her turn to speak through counsel, was poised and articulate, and said absolutely nothing that was untrue while constructing something entirely false. She spoke of her son's memory. She spoke of continuity and heritage, and what the children's father would have wanted. She did not once look at Eli, who was in the waiting area outside with Simone, drawing in his notebook. The judge listened to everything. She was a woman in her mid-50s with the expression of someone who had heard every version of every story and was waiting, always, for the one that rang true. She put her questions to Evangeline directly, about her work, about the boys, routines, about what she understood her role to be going forward. Evangeline answered all of them. When she talked about Eli, her voice had a quality that no brief could manufacture. When she talked about Milo, the judge made a note. Then the doors at the back of the courtroom opened. Taeju Yu walked in. He was not scheduled to testify. He was not required to be there. His presence was not part of the legal strategy Evangeline's attorney had prepared, and she could see her attorney go briefly still in the way of a person recalibrating. Constance Adler's team exchanged a glance. The judge looked up. He walked to the front of the courtroom and requested, through proper procedure, to make a statement relevant to the character and fitness of the primary petitioner. The judge, after a brief exchange with both attorneys, allowed it. He stood and spoke. Not about the agreement, not about the public narrative around him or Ji Un-baek or the fund or any of the machinery of his life. He spoke about what he had seen in his house over the past several weeks. He spoke about a woman who had moved 2 children into a new environment and built them a routine so steadily and so quietly that by the 3rd week, the younger one was asking if they could plant something in the garden. He spoke about a 7-year-old who had, last Tuesday, left a drawing on his desk, of the dock, of the water, of 2 figures standing at the edge, without a word, just left it there, because children communicate the truth before anyone asks them to. In his professional life, he had assessed hundreds of people for reliability, for character, for the kind of integrity that held under pressure. Evangeline Moore possessed more of those qualities than almost anyone he had encountered. The children were safe with her. He delivered that last sentence the way a man speaks when he knows what the word safe means from experience of its absence. The courtroom was very quiet. Constance Adler's attorney requested a recess. Evangeline looked at the table in front of her and pressed both hands flat against it and breathed. The judge granted Evangeline primary custody of Eli and Milo 2 hours later. Visitation rights for Constance Adler, structured and supervised in the initial period, pending a follow-up review in 6 months. The ruling was careful and thorough, and when Evangeline's attorney read it aloud in a summary in the hallway afterward, Evangeline stood very still and let it land. Eli was in the hallway. He had been told nothing. Simone had kept him and Milo in the waiting area through all of it, with snacks and a phone loaded with the nature documentary he liked. And Milo had fallen asleep on Simone's lap at some point and was still there, peaceful, entirely unaware that his whole future had just been decided 40 feet away. Eli looked up from his notebook when Evangeline came through the door. He looked at her face. He was 7 years old, and he had learned to read adults for information before they gave it. Then his face did something she had not seen it do in 4 months. It let go. She went to him and crouched down, and he came into her arms, not with the careful, measured contact of a child who had learned to be cautious, but with the full weight of him, both arms around her neck, the way he used to when he was smaller, and the world was still safe, and his mother was still there. She held him for a long time. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that the holding didn't already say better. Milo woke up eventually, looked around, decided the situation called for joining the hug, and inserted himself accordingly. Simone stood to the side with her hand over her mouth, mostly failing at not crying in a courthouse hallway. Taeju stood a few feet away, watching the three of them with that particular stillness of his. And he looked like a man who had been given access to something he hadn't known he was missing. When Evangeline finally stood up, Milo on her hip and Eli close at her side, she looked at Taeju. She didn't say thank you immediately, because thank you wasn't quite the right shape for what she felt. What she felt was larger and more complicated than that. Gratitude, yes, but also recognition. The recognition of a person who had done something not because it served them, but because it was right, and had asked nothing for it. You didn't have to do that, she said. I know. It could have made things worse for you, with the fund, with the coverage. I know. She looked at him for a moment. Milo had already started pulling at her arm, pointing at something down the hallway, a water fountain, as it turned out, which he found inexplicably fascinating every time. Milo, hold on, she started, and then felt Taeju step forward and take Milo's other hand with the ease of a man who had been doing it for weeks, which he had. Come on. His voice was the same quiet, unhurried register he used for everything that mattered. Let's go see the fountain. And Milo went with him, immediately, without question, in the way that children go with people they have decided they can trust. Eli watched them go. Then he looked up at Evangeline with that old soul expression. He's good, Eli said simply. Yeah, she said. He is. In the hallway near the elevator, Ji Eun-baek was there. She'd come. Someone on Constance's team had given her the date, and she'd positioned herself near the window at the end of the corridor with the composure of a woman who had prepared for multiple outcomes. Evangeline saw her. Their eyes met across the corridor. Evangeline held her gaze. Not coldly, not triumphantly, just honestly. This is what happened, the look said. This is who he chose to stand for. Ji-eun looked away first. She picked up her bag, walked toward the elevator, and didn't look back. Evangeline watched her go. She felt, to her own surprise, nothing harsh, something closer to sorrow. For a woman who had loved someone enough to try to destroy him when she couldn't keep him, and who had still lost. That was its own kind of grief. She didn't say that to anyone, but she held it. 2 weeks after the hearing, Ji Eun-baek gave an interview to a lifestyle magazine in which she was photographed in her own apartment in South Beach, looking reflective and beautiful, and said several things that were true and a few that were not, and generally positioned herself as a woman who had spoken her truth and was now moving on. The article ran. Most people read it and thought nothing of it. The news cycle moved. The Sovereign Wealth Fund meeting happened the following Monday. Taeju spent 4 hours with the representatives. Evangeline did not attend. This one he did not ask her to, because it was his to win or lose on his own terms. He won it. He brought it up that evening at dinner with the economy of a man reporting something finished. The fund signed. Evangeline looked up from the contract she was reviewing. Congratulations. Milo, who had been listening with the particular attention of a 3-year-old who didn't understand the words but understood the tone, announced, Yay, TJ? Taeju looked at him for a moment with an expression that was becoming, over time, less guarded. Thank you, Milo. The 90 days of the agreement were technically up in 3 weeks. Neither of them had mentioned it. Evangeline had thought about it. She was a practical woman. She thought about most things. But every time she tried to turn it into a conversation, it felt like the wrong language for what the situation had actually become. The agreement was a document they'd signed in a state of mutual desperation. What existed now was something that didn't have a document and didn't need one. One evening, after the boys were asleep, she found him in the garden again. She sat beside him on the low bench at the dock's edge, a bench she'd had brought in from a nursery 3 weeks earlier, because standing every evening wasn't practical, and they looked at the water together. The 90 days, she said. Yes. What do you want to do? He was quiet. Not avoidance, but the quiet of a man taking a question seriously that deserved to be taken seriously. "I want to ask you something," he began. Not as part of any arrangement. Not for an audience or a filing or a narrative. I want to ask you because the answer matters to me in a way that has nothing to do with strategy. She waited. "Would you stay?" A pause. And then more carefully. "Not for them. Though they're part of everything now, and I'm not pretending otherwise. Would you stay for this?" A gesture that was simple and encompassed the garden, the water, the house behind them, the unquantifiable fact of two people who had found, in the middle of a crisis, the extraordinary thing of being exactly right for each other. For us, if there's an us, which I think there is, which I have thought for some time. She was quiet for a long moment. She thought about her sister, not as the raw presence of loss, but as something steadier now, more like company. She thought about what Natalie would have said about this man, this house, this improbable thing. She thought Natalie would have laughed first, and then cried, and then said, "Evie, obviously." "I've been thinking about something," she said. "Tell me." "The East Wing. The layout doesn't work for what we actually use it for. The sitting room between the two bedrooms could be opened up to create a proper studio. The boys need more space as they get older, and Eli is serious about the drawing, more serious than most people realize. I've been sketching some ideas." He looked at her. "That's a renovation," he said. "Yes." "That suggests a certain permanence." "It does." She looked at him. "I'll need at least a year to do it right." Something in his face, that carefully maintained composure, the distance he'd kept between himself and the world for so long, finally, fully shifted. Not dramatically, not with performance, just warmth, uncovered, like something that had been there the whole time under something that no longer needed to be there. "A year," he said. "Minimum." He reached out and took her hand. He did it simply, without ceremony, the way you did something when you'd stopped needing to make it mean something extra and could just let it mean what it meant. She let him. The water moved. The city glittered at them from across the bay. "All right," he said. 6 months later, the family court follow-up review found that Eli and Milo were thriving. The judge noted, in a phrase that would be read aloud by Simone Price approximately 14 times over the following year, often at dinner, that the children displayed exceptional stability, emotional security, and a clear sense of home. Eli had started drawing in color. He'd filled 4 notebooks. The one Taeju kept on his desk, the one with the dock and the 2 figures, was framed now, on the wall of his office. He hadn't made a production of it. He'd simply put it there, and it was there. Milo, for his part, had planted something in the garden. A small lemon tree, on a Saturday morning, with Taeju's help and a great deal of narration about the correct depth for roots, and whether worms were friendly or not. Conclusion: friendly. It was growing. Constance Adler's supervised visitations began. She came the first time looking like a woman prepared for battle and left, looking like a woman who had seen something she hadn't expected. 2 children so clearly, so undeniably, so completely at home, that the argument she'd spent 8 months building had nowhere left to stand. She didn't stop fighting immediately, but she stopped fighting loudly. Ji-eun Baek flew to Seoul in November. Taeju heard from a mutual contact that she was seeing someone, an architect, which Evangeline found, privately, extremely funny. She hoped, genuinely, that Ji-eun found what she was looking for. Anger was an exhausting place to live. Evangeline had thought, in the early weeks, that the hardest part of raising Eli and Milo would be the logistical enormity of it. The school runs and the doctor's appointments and the particular infinity of small decisions that filled every day. That part was hard, but the hardest part, the real one, was the way they carried their mother. Not in grief, exactly. Grief had its own shape, and she knew it. They carried her in the everyday things, in the way Eli sometimes made a face that belonged entirely to Natalie, in the way Milo reached for orange juice every morning because his mother had always given him orange juice, in the way they sometimes, without knowing they were doing it, looked at the door when they heard a sound, and then looked away. They were healing. She watched them heal, day by day, the way you watch something grow, not the growth itself, which was invisible, but the evidence of it, undeniable, accumulating. She healed too, not in a straight line, not completely. She didn't think you ever reached completely, and she had stopped waiting for it. But there were whole days now when the grief was quiet, present but quiet, like a room you kept the door to but no longer needed to live in. She could think about Natalie and smile. She could look at Eli's face and see her sister there and feel it as gift rather than wound. Evangeline's renovation of the East Wing took 14 months, not 12. It always does. But the studio was exactly what she'd sketched on that first evening on the dock. Open, generous, full of the particular Miami light that comes in from the east and turns everything it touches into gold. Eli used it every afternoon. He would sit at his desk and draw for an hour, and then look up and say that it felt like thinking out loud in there. She understood that. She'd spent most of her life thinking out loud in the language of buildings, in walls and windows, and the way a space could tell you what it was for before you'd been told anything. This house had done that from the beginning. She'd just been too careful to listen. On the night they moved Eli's desk into the new studio, Milo fell asleep on the floor in a patch of moonlight, the way children sometimes do when they've worn themselves completely out with the pleasure of a good day. Taeju picked him up without waking him, the way he always did, with the particular competence of a man who had learned, one ordinary evening at a time, exactly how much care a small person required, and carried him to his room. Evangeline stood in the studio doorway and watched, and felt, for the first time in a long time, the simple and enormous fact of not being alone. Not because she'd needed saving. She hadn't. She'd walked into a deal with clear eyes and gotten something she'd paid for. But somewhere between the terrace at the Meridian Tower and a courthouse hallway, and a bench at the end of a dock on a Miami night, something had grown in the space that the deal had opened up. Something that had nothing to do with contracts, and everything to do with two people who had been honest with each other, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard, and had discovered that honesty, sustained and repeated and refused to be abandoned even at the worst moments, was what love actually looked like once you stripped away everything else. She walked to Eli's desk and straightened the stack of new notebooks she'd put there. She looked at the light on the water through the open window. She thought, Natalie, her sister's name, held inside herself the way she held it now. Not as loss, but as presence, as witness, as the person she was still telling everything to, just from a greater distance. See, she thought, we're okay. We're more than okay. Behind her, she heard Taeju come back down the hall. He stopped in the doorway. She didn't turn around. He barely woke up, he said. He never does. A pause. Then she heard him cross the room. He stood beside her at the window, looking at the same water they'd looked at on so many nights by now that it felt like theirs, which it wasn't, and was. We should do the lemon tree tomorrow, he said. Milo says it needs water. Milo monitors that tree like it's a project. He is his aunt's nephew. She turned and looked at him. He was already looking at her, and his face had that quality it always had now. Open, unhurried, absolutely certain of where he was standing, and with whom. She reached up and touched his face, just briefly, with the back of her hand. The gesture of a woman who had stopped needing to make things formal. Let's go water the tree, she said. And they did. Under the Miami night, in the garden that had stopped being his and started being theirs, next to the small lemon tree that was, against most expectations, but not against the particular stubbornness of things that are loved, growing.